Hi, and welcome to the Storyfest 2022. My name is Lolita Parek, and I am a second year student at Middlesex University. Can you first let us know a little bit about yourselves, in case some of us don't know, if that's okay? Sammy, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. You have to forgive me. My I don't know if it's my computer or someone else's, but it does keep freezing on people's webcams, so forgive me. Yeah, so my name's Sammy H.K. Smith. I live in Oxfordshire in the United Kingdom. I write mostly science fiction and fantasy. My latest book, Anna, is out with Rebellion Publishing, but I also run Grimbold Books, which is a British Fantasy Award-winning sci-fi publisher in the UK. Day job, I'm a police officer, and I've got 2 children, and I'm perpetually tired.
That's great. What about you, Susannah?
So I'm Susannah Wise, and I am an author and an actor. I live in London, and I have my debut novel, This Fragile Earth, came out last June, June 21. I have a second novel coming out this year, which is slightly different. Yeah, my other job is acting on screen and stage, although less stage since I've been writing more full-time. And I have one son who's 12. And I'm probably tired too, but I don't do half as much as what it sounds like Sammy does. So yeah, thank you for having me.
That's great. We're really happy to have you both on this panel. Right, so if I can start with one question, and then I will pass it on to Olga to set a second, and we'll go back and forth in between us two, if that's all right. So first question that I had was, could you tell us more about your recent publications? How did you come up with the ideas and concept, and what was your inspiration? Sammy, do you want to start, and then we'll go over to Susannah? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. So my most recent publication is Anna with Rebellion Publishing. Anna it's a bit of a mouthful, but I describe it as a bit of a dystopian literary speculative feminist fiction, because it doesn't seem to hit one particular strand of the genre. It's set in a dystopia England after World War III, non-nuclear, a little bit close for comfort right now. And it follows one woman on her journey of PTSD after sexual abuse. There's power and control themes throughout the novel. And it came about because for the last 16 years, I've worked within domestic abuse as a detective. So I specialise in sexual abuse and high-end domestic abuse, like the GBH's, coercive controlling behaviour. And quite often, a question is asked of a woman: why didn't you report it? Why didn't you scream? Why didn't you shout? Why didn't you behave in particular set responses that people think rape victims will behave in? So I wanted to write something that was challenging and sort of subverted those norms, and was what I felt was a more realistic response to sexual abuse. So it started initially as a bit of a fluffier piece. I wanted to write something that was a woman who was wronged, and then, you know, the strength of a woman, she comes back gung-ho, getting revenge on all of her abusers. But actually, the more I wrote it, the more I realized that I couldn't quite take that fantastical leap. So it was more a journey, a story of Anna and how she overcomes her issues, rather than potentially getting revenge on everyone who's ever wronged her. I think that'll do.
That actually sounds really interesting. Thanks, Sammy. You, Susannah?
Yeah, Sammy, that sounds amazing. Amazing. My novel is a mother and son survival story set in the near future in London and the Midlands. It's sort of just pre kind of apocalyptic event where all the communications go down, and then gas, electricity and water get cut off, and everything kind of falls into chaos, as one might expect. And then for a reason which I won't disclose, the mother and son then have to flee London and go to try and find the protagonist's mother, up in a tiny little village in the middle of nowhere. And when they get there, everything is not as it seems. The novel, I wrote the first draft of it in 2015, long before the pandemic was a twinkle in anybody's eye. I mean, it doesn't concern a pandemic, the book. It's apocalyptic. Causes are not viral. But there was a great deal of correlations between what was happening in my book and the beginning of that whole pandemic in March 2020, and the way more to do with the way people were reacting actually than the events. The sort of inception for the novel was that shortly before I began writing it, my father, who was 90, was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And I mean, he was still very sharp-minded, he although he was old. So he'd had cancer for a while, but it suddenly went kind of, stage 5 or whatever, or 5, and he was given the kind of terminal prognosis. And that night I went home and lay in bed, and my son was only about 4 at the time, or 4.5, and I lay in bed thinking, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen to us? I think more as a sort of way of kind of dealing with the trauma of the news that I just received. So, and I came up with the entire kind of concept for the novel, not really thinking it was going to be a book, but just this sort of catastrophic fantasy, which was the idea of my son and I being completely isolated, and then when you think the worst thing that's happened happens, then there's more. So that was the inception for that novel. Yeah.
Sounds incredibly fascinating. And it seems like both Sammy and Susannah, your stories sort of revolve around very personal and emotional themes, and you really want to flesh out your protagonists. So how do you find that? How were your books received by your readers and critics? Was it what you wanted to achieve? Did you find that readers really resonated with that, or over to you?
Yeah, I'm just smiling to myself here. I mean, every author who sells a book or publishes a book wants it to be received and glowing praise, and everybody love it, and it become a worldwide bestseller. I think a very good way of describing Anna is it is polarizing. People have either loved it because they can understand it and resonate with it, or they have utterly hated it. And I'll be very, very candid. SFX magazine gave me 1 star and said, what's the point of this? The Times called it a hard-hitting feminist fable. Historia Lit, which is a feminist blog, felt it was the best book they'd read since Dracula, whereas several Goodreads writers, all 1 star, said it was as misogynistic as The Handmaid's Tale, which really doesn't make sense, but there we go. I think they mean misandry, but I wasn't going to correct them on that. So it's been a mixed bunch, which initially, when you receive that very first negative criticism, it's awful. You just don't want to leave your house, because this baby that you've poured all your emotions into, somebody hates it. But actually, the more reviews you receive and the more reception you receive, it's great. And I'll be honest, I absolutely love it when I get either a 1 star or a 5-star review, because I'm making people feel things. They'll either have a strong emotional response to show that they love it, or they hate it. And it's much better than those, it was okay type reviews, because they haven't resonated with the reader. They're going to forget the book. Whereas if somebody passionately hates it, as one reviewer does, because they keep going back to their review every 3 months and adding a few more lines as to why they hate it, even a year later, you're making them feel something, and you've got underneath their skin which is fantastic. And I love that response. So it's been polarizing is the phrase I'd use for it.
That's amazing, Sammy. Reviewer who keeps going back. That's brilliant. Well, I mean, really what Sammy said in terms of, you know, when you ask, is it what you hoped? I mean, if you don't win the Booker Prize, it's not what you hoped, you know, it's that, yeah, I think it went as well as, I mean, I've got nothing to compare it to in terms of, I suppose I could only compare it to other people, and that's, as I know from being an actor, I have 25 years of acting experience, you know, daily rejection, never be, you know, marathon not a sprint, yada yada. So I'm very used to looking at my peers and going, you know, why aren't I doing as well as them? Or I'm doing better, and I sort of weirdly feel this sort of strange guilt. So I would say I sat in that space, that same space. I don't read my reviews. When the book first came out, I sort of went on Amazon and I was like, oh, and then they were like, you know, 5 stars, 1 or whatever, 1 stars, and I just thought, no, I'm not going to go down that road. So I've avoided reading anything. So I've got no idea what my what my reviews were like, but obviously I know my mum liked it. No, I mean, you know, I know people who I know or meet are very complimentary. I assume when they don't say anything, they probably didn't like it that much, or they haven't read it. What's really lovely is getting people who you've never met before contact you, often on things like social media or through your website, for example, my website, to tell me how much they love the book. And that really means something, because there is no reason for them to tell me it unless they really felt moved to do it, you know, by themselves. So that's wonderful. That's been really lovely.
I'll echo that. I had a sexual abuse survivor email Rebellion off their own back because they didn't want to approach me direct, but subsequently that email filtered with their permission down to me, and it was just pages and pages of heartfelt outpouring of emotion, and that just wipes away every single negative review you get, because I can have 100 1-star reviews, but if one survivor feels that their voice has been listened to and they've been heard and they can connect with their book and it's helped them in any way, then that's job done as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with that as well, that the little outpourings of love, or those little follows on Twitter, and it's people that you haven't got anyone in common with, but actually they're book reviews and bloggers, and they send you that little DM. When you've had a crappy day, those really make a difference and spur you on to write the next book.
And actually, and I know this sounds a bit disingenuous, but I do mean it, and it's hard to hold it in my heart sometimes, but actually those things are much more meaningful than any prize winning. I mean, they're not more meaningful in terms of my bank balance, because obviously if you win a prize, everyone wants to buy a book and whatever, but they're much more meaningful in terms of what it truly is to have a successful novel, because you know, there are so many other mitigating factors to why things get listed for prizes or whatever. But when a person, like you say, you know, writes to you with like Sammy was saying about, you know, writes to you a letter about your novel affecting them, that is really profoundly moving and means much more than anything else could, really.
Thank you so much for this. This is such a heartfelt, evidently beautiful sort of way of talking about your practice, so thank you. And you both mentioned that you get this amazing response from readers sometimes, and you know that you can take it further and really it encourages you to write further, and you both write about sort of empowered female lead characters and sort of consider what will happen with our society in the future. So are there any political messages, and so is there any stance that you take in regards to what's going on currently in the world, and where you would like the world where would you like the society to go further from where we are today?
So Anna is broken into 3 parts. We have a dystopia, utopia, and like a sense of nature. So 3 different, very different parts and voices. which can be a bit off-putting sometimes when you read it. But the dystopia starts straight after a non-nuclear World War III. Russia is involved, but we are running out of natural resources. So there's been a lot of bombs, hospitals and schools were first to be hit, along with utilities, and people are conscripted. So families are broken up, and there's very little communication. So with the dystopia to utopia, I wanted to show the power and control, not only of one person, but the power of a community, and what your voice will actually achieve if you're prepared to put yourself on the line. I don't want to go into it too much because it will spoil my book, but there's a balance between power and control in relationships between partners, and there's power and control in society and community. So the message that I've sort of got out there is to put your fingers up to the big man, and if something is wrong, then you need to speak up about it, even at the risk of personal sacrifice. It's always easier said than done, but there are snippets of this throughout dialogue in the book. And that nature, part 3 is set entirely in nature, and that nature survives and nature will heal. But without us, if we keep bombing it, if we keep depleting it of all the natural resources, then there's not going to be much left of the world. So that's the only real political message that I've got in mind. It is more the journey of the person, but it does have those sort of themes within the narrative.
I'm slightly hesitant to answer that, the sort of question in a macro version, because it's such a massive one. But in terms of my novel, I suppose, like Sammy, I would say that when I set out to write the book, I didn't have an agenda at all about climate change or anything. I just knew what I felt inside on a cellular level about the earth. I've always had a great connection to, I spent half my life in the, like where this little village is set is no surprise. I spent a lot of my childhood in this place that I set it. And my happiest, go-to memories are from there, and they're almost always involve no other human beings, just me in nature. So I knew I wanted to try to convey that experience, and I guess for this, within the story, that's all it potentially going to be taken away, or who knows what's happening. So and I put the protagonist very isolated into that environment, but perhaps not in a very relaxing situation. So as the book progressed, I realized I had stronger, so it was only once I read the draft back, I was like, oh, it sounded like I had really strong feelings that were sort of, they were latent. They weren't on the front of my consciousness. I wrote a lot about I write about Gaia in the novel as a sort of entity, and I found myself getting moved. I don't mean by my own writing, but by the concept of what had come out of myself without me realizing, if you see what I mean. So it's like a sort of therapeutic experience. So yeah, I guess it's latently in me, this very strong emotion about the earth, and the earth as a living, breathing, organic thing that has its own control. I mean, if you read James Lovelock, I read Novacine. I don't know if anyone's read that. Which is the coming age of the AI, and his whole take on that is quite benign, really, surprisingly. Unlike, people like Nick Bostrom, who write super intelligence, who write about AI as a kind of very kind of malign, potentially malign force.
I also, in part 3, I refer back a lot to different world wars that we've had. So I make some not too subtle references to Wilfred Owen's poems, and I have a mass grave scene which was reminiscent of World War II and the concentration camps, because there is a thread that follows that along in my story. to show that as a race, as one race, we haven't changed. You know, we haven't learned from the history's gone by. We're still intent on destroying each other, regardless of, you know, what we might feel. We're not a civilized society, and you know, that aspect has hit well with readers, and they've understood what I'm trying to achieve there, I think.
That's so interesting, Sammy, because the other thing that happened when I'd finished my novel, and sometime after I'd finished it, not straight after, like reading it back, but like 3 years later, when I was still kind of working through it and then had an editor and blah, blah, I read it and thought, oh my God, I've written my dad was a kinder transport refugee from Austria, and came as a teenage boy to England, to live in England. And I realised I'd sort of written a version of my father's own Holocaust journey. And funnily enough, there's a scene in my novel which has a sort of echoes of a mass grave type thing. The ending of my novel, I mean, unfortunately, I better not say what it is now, but it's quite a hopeful ending, I hope. But the ending of my novel was very different originally. To me, it was still a hopeful novel, because I don't see human beings as the most important creatures on the planet, or the most important aspect of the planet. But my editors and some other people in the industry had said they felt that people would feel too sad by the ending, so I had to change it. So it probably isn't the most authentic version of what I would have written, that ending, had I been left to my own devices. But maybe I only would have sold 2 novels if that had been the case.
Well, I managed to sell Rebellion without a literary agent, because every agent that I approached said it was too polarizing. They did not know how they would sell a novel on sexual abuse and post-traumatic stress disorder to a mainstream publisher. So yeah, I completely sympathize there. I didn't have, thankfully, any massive changes to make, but certainly there were tweaks along the way, which was make it a little bit more hopeful, maybe not quite so dark and miserable, you know. Let's try and have some hope in this novel. But it's certainly, like you say, I didn't intend to write it that way, but I guess it just comes out the way that it wants to after you start writing. It's a very true adage that they say, you know, these characters sometimes don't do what we want them to do. These characters have their own voices, and they go off on their own tangents, and they do their own things, and we kind of have to go with them or work bloody hard to try and pull them back onto track.
And also, I think it's about reflecting when anyone writes, one is trying to reflect the world around oneself in whatever version, even if you're writing it as a space opera, you're still reflecting the world around you. And I guess it's about that's when your own personal view comes out, and it may not chime with the market, you know, or whatever. Like you say, I'm so pleased you did that without and didn't listen to anyone and just got on.
I'm very stubborn.
Yeah.
Well, actually, to be fair, this will make you all giggle. Anyone who's read Anna or been through it, I wrote it back in 2012, and I shelved it for years and years because I started Grimbold, and life just took over. But an agent did look at it then and took it on, but then said, I've read it and I'd love to change it to a young adult romance. And I went, he's a rapist. I'm like, I don't think this is going to work. I don't think this is going to be a harmonious relationship. So I walked away from that one and sort of then just left it for ages until the opportunity arose to submit it to Rebellion. But yeah, I think sometimes you have to stick to your core beliefs, and not change that work too much from the message that you're trying to convey, because then you're not doing yourself justice either, because there were parts that I cut out of Anna. Rebellion asked me to make it non-generic, non-descriptive as to where the location was set, because they said, you know, forgive me, audience, they said Americans like things that they can relate to, and unless it's set in London, they sometimes find it quite difficult. So I did that. I cut reams of the world building out, and then one of the biggest criticisms I've had is, we don't really know where this is set. What's the world building like? So you do kick yourself and you sort of think, well, maybe I should have dug my heels in a little. but yeah, I think you've just got to remain true to the story that you want to tell, as best as you can, while balancing the wants of your publisher, editor, agent, whoever.
So from what you're saying, I'm gathering that perhaps it's not really the climate itself or any political, the political aspects and the climate change are the backdrop for your own personal lives as well. And so the themes in your work reflect things that you care about as an author personally. And is there something you'd like to communicate to make the connection with the reader?
I think you've got to have, and I like this phrase, authentic human connection with your characters. Certainly I would say Susannah's and my novels are quite similar in that they are character-led, they're emotion-led, and it's about the relationships between the characters. And they have to be authentic, and you have to be able to convey personal experience over, because there's no point trying to write outside of what you know when you're writing a character-led novel that is heavy on the emotion and heavy on the relationships. So yeah, that's certainly for me, that's, write what you know, put your twist on it, put whichever genre you write in, put your twist on it, but don't try to write something that's so outrageously out there that you've got no experience of. And if you do, that's where beta readers, sensitivity readers, editors will come in and help. But you have to feel what you're writing, because otherwise you'll never get that first draft finished.
Exactly so. And I think, we all use avatars of ourselves when we write. And some are closer to ourselves than others, and some it's like lots of paintings that only have one color, and so because This Fragile Earth was my first novel, and it was the novel I wrote first, it is, the protagonist Signy is probably quite similar, very similar to me, but in some really profound ways she is not. She's substantially more grumpier than I am, and there are lots of other things about her that are not me. And then I've written a second novel and also have a female protagonist, and she is also has aspects of myself in a very, very different way, but again, is, I don't know, more whatever, I'm not going to talk about her, but very different to me. So I think we just use lots of sort of, they're like pins in a map, where you find your way through using those markers.
So how would you say you pace yourself in your life as a writer and also as a person, a parent? How do you manage that emotional involvement with the story in your writing and in your practice?
Do you mean I just want to be clear about what you're asking. Do you mean how do I manage my writing life, or do you mean how do I keep a handle on, because I don't think, when people say that, Sammy, you're going to know a lot about taking your work home with you. I imagine in your other job that's pretty major. As an actor, I don't need to take my work home with me, because it's like we're all putting masks on all the time, so we're all performing in one way or another. And I don't know if you're doing a play or whatever, it can all become a bit kind of, I think if you're very young, you can all take it very seriously. I'm very old and long in the tooth, and I just sort of walk out the door and let it go. But in terms of writing, things stay with me all the time, but I am good at parking them, because it's really important to park the work so that it can marinate, almost like a cryptic crossword. The brain is still working on it, but conscious brain has to close down so that work can happen. Like waking at 4 a.m, which I frequently do because I'm probably about to go through the menopause. I find myself having some really good ideas at 4 a.m. Luckily, I don't need to write them down because I actually remember them because I have quite a good memory. But my son is at school. I write during the day. I find that if I start work at 8 in the morning and get 3 or 4 hours done, then that's pretty much me done, unless I come back and do some editing in the afternoon. And I work straight through without a break, because I find I'm very good at focusing, and I have no problem not involving myself in anything else, including social media or anything. It doesn't matter. Like, things can be popping up my computer, and I'm like, it's like I'm sort of on drugs or something, like weird ADHD meds or something. I'm just like, but when I say I'm not like a huge prolific word count person. I see people saying things like they've written 6,000 words, and I think, oh my God, how did you do that? You know, I don't. Mine is pretty low.
I think I'm almost the polar opposite to Susannah in the way that I work. I am chaotic, and I messaged Adam before this, and I said, don't worry, I'm going to be there, because I think he was panicking that I would be off at work or somewhere else and have forgotten. I said, I'll look like my usual scatty self, don't you worry. Because my work and my life is so busy, I literally just try to grab writing time when I can, which is few and far between. I would absolutely adore to be able to have like a set schedule to be able to get ideas and words out, but unfortunately I just can't. You know, at the moment I work 60 plus hours a week in my arena, because it's absolutely crazy post lockdown, as you can imagine. But my mind is always on the go, and I do have a notes section on my phone, and I recommend this for anyone who is out and about, you know, walking down the street, shopping. That little idea, that little seed pops into your head, make a note of it, because my short-term memory and long-term, unfortunately, are pretty crappy right now. So I just make a note of an idea. It might just be a sentence, it might just be a bit of dialogue that I've thought a character might say, or the opening paragraph to a new work in progress, something that sparks interest. Write it down, don't forget it. I actually think that most writers would be more successful if they set a daily target, even if it's 100 words, 200 words, you know, 50 or 1,000, whatever. And even if you're not in the mood to write, sit down in front of your notebook, computer, whatever it is you use to write on, and do something in the writing world. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect. If you're like me, you like to write a perfect first draft, and that's very frustrating, and I need to learn that that's never going to happen. But get those bones down in the story. When it comes to the hours that I work and the subject matter that I deal with, and what I write is, with experience, I've worked in my department since I was 20, and I'm now 38. So all of my 20s and nearly all of my 30s has been domestic abuse and relationships. So I'm very good at leaving it at the door. There is Work Sammy, and Work Sammy even has a different surname, because I want to differentiate my private life and work life. So Work Sammy has maiden name, Home Sammy has married name. I leave my work at the door. When I clock off, I'm then mum, I'm Sam, I'm my wife, I'm a mother, I'm a writer. I'm nothing to do with what I deal with at work, which I think is the only way that people can really cope working in my arena. And certainly we see burnout all the time for those people who haven't learned to close that door, and to switch themselves off. And when it comes to writing as well, I wrote Anna before I even had children, and there, you know, there is, and it's not a spoiler, it's on the back cover, her rapist makes her pregnant, and she deals with giving birth and the baby. I am the oldest of 9 kids, so I did have a bit of knowledge on how to raise a baby and change a nappy. So I was able to write that aspect quite well, but it was only when I became a mother to my son, who is a very precious baby. As I always share with people, he's an IVF baby, so he is very precious to me, that I was able to go back to my draft of Anna and really put that emotional nuance into what I was writing. And it's one of the reasons why I still to this day don't deal with child abuse at work, and refuse to go to injuries and deaths of babies, because I know my limits, and I know that I need to cut my work at the door when I come in. So if you are writing something that's particularly emotional, or particularly emotion-led or trigger-led, it's okay to take breaks from that work. It's okay to finish what you're writing, realize you're not in the emotional headspace, and park it. Don't push through something that you're not ready to write with or to address, and speak to people about it, because there are other writers that I've come across within Grimbolds that have written particularly harrowing things that have then translated and turned out to be sort of memories of their past, and they hadn't realized that they were writing it quite so closely, and then they've sought help for it. And absolutely do that. So whatever you do it with earnest, and do it sort of with conviction, but don't forget to look after yourself, I think, is the important thing.
I'm so in awe of you, Sammy, that you work a 60-hour week and you have the
I've got all these bags, Susannah. I've got the
don't know
light
that
on
at
me
all.
here to try and hide them.
And you have still have the spirit and the will to sit down and write. I think that's really amazing. I mean, because I as an actor, I spend a lot of time not working, as you can imagine. And so that's why I get all this freedom to write during the days. And actually, even when I am working, it's brilliant because I take my laptop, and there's so much sitting around on a set anyway that I've got hours to what it's like being paid to write. It's brilliant. So I'm very, very lucky, and I really am very much respect to you, you know.
Well, I haven't actually written anything more than about 10,000 words in the last year, because truth be told, I like to get in, put my lounge pants on, put Netflix on, and just eat. It's one. But when I do sort of get that drive, and when I do have the time to write, then I put my headphones on. The kids are in bed. My husband knows, right, it's time for him to play his PlayStation or whatever. He's not getting any sense out of me for a few hours. But they are very, very rare and far and few between. But it is mostly the notes I do. So if anyone else sort of lives as chaotic and busy life, you know, studying, doing university, working, raising a family, and just feels that they're not getting that time to write, even making those notes, plotting something out, you know, just a few minutes each day doing that, and you're making progress. You're already ahead of where you were a month ago. So you know, sort of sometimes it can be depressing looking at the likes of Brandon Sanderson, who religiously writes 10,000 words a day and has written 4 novels in secret. But we're not all Brandon Sanderson, and we're not all sort of living at home paid to write effectively. You know, we live lives, and we have responsibilities outside of our writing careers. So just whatever you do, a few lines a day, that is progress, and everybody should be proud of themselves for that.
I really echo that, because during lockdown, obviously I was homeschooling. My son was like 10 when it all started, and none of us had any idea, you know, we didn't have enough computers in the house, let alone anything else for all three. You know, my partner also used computer work, so I couldn't write because I was teaching, basically, my son, I mean, and I was supposed to be starting a 3rd novel, and I was averaging about 50 to 100 words a day. And I wrote to my agent, and I said, I'm writing 100 words a day. It's all I'm writing. And she said, well, that's still 100. You're writing 100 words a day. So, you know, in 5 years, you'll have a novel. And I pretty much, you know, it took me about 19 months to write a first draft of that book as a result, because everything's been so fractured. But I got it done. So I totally agree with you, Sammy, that it's not about, you know, massive word counts, and set realistic expectations, and put your bar below where you think you can manage, because there is nothing so demotivating as not hitting your goals. If you hit your goals, it's very motivating, and actually if you overshoot your goals, it's you feel like $1 million or pounds or rubles. Well,
1 million rubles isn't going to get you far. No, I mean, I always try to do National Novel Writing Month, and I always fail, because I think it's something like 1,600 words a day or something you're supposed to do. And I start out with good intentions, and I always fail. So absolutely echo what you say there. You know, set a target, and then maybe take 20% off, because, you know, things happen. Sometimes you're not in the mood, or something, emergencies crop up. So yeah, you don't want to be demotivated.
And would you say that any of those notes that you take throughout the day, on your phone, or just jot them down, do you ever find that sometimes when you come back to them, they become something else, or a completely different story, that just takes its own shape?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So some of the notes that I started, I wanted to write a gothic steampunk whodidit murder mystery, and that's actually becoming Emma. I've lifted the bones of that story, which is now the 2nd novel set in my post-apocalyptic world. So I've taken the murder mystery whodunit, but added human trafficking, drugs, and more depressing themes, as I like to do. But certainly bits of dialogue between characters, motivations, the actual main theme of grief and how we deal with grief has become the backbone for my next novel. So yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you just got to go with what feels right. And it's just like I say, you know, you might have an image in your head, a little snapshot, a vignette of something in a story. Write it down, because if you don't use it for your current work in progress, you might come back to it and think, oh, that was so cool. And you've got to write a little short story to go around that image. But whatever you're doing, whenever you're writing, you're honing your craft, you know, you're practicing, you're getting those words out, you're improving day by day by day. The more you write, the more you read, the better you'll become. So yeah, it definitely does. I do go back to those notes and use them.
Would you say that that applies to you as well?
Well, I didn't jump in there because I don't tend to take notes, as Sammy has described herself doing. Because of the levels of weird obsessive focus that I seem to be able to apply to my life, which has its advantages, as in novel writing, and disadvantages in other areas. I find that all my thinking is about whatever it is that I'm writing. So I'm always amazed when I read interviews or hear people say, novelists say, oh, I wrote a book and then and it wasn't working. I'd written 70,000 words and then I chucked it away because it wasn't, or I wrote a book and then I put it in a drawer because I didn't like it. And I'm thinking, what? Like, what? I am very dogged. So my books are written the triumph of will over adversity, and so my notes to myself, which are on my on my iPhone as I talk to myself as I walk around Hampstead Heath or whatever, are all to do with whatever it is that I'm writing at that time. And sometimes, so for example, when my first novel was coming out, I was having to edit my second novel as a sort of final edit, and that was quite complicated for me because I was jumping between two different worlds. So I find that quite tricky. I think inside I'm a man because I don't seem to be able to multitask that but I yeah, so my notes are just about whatever it is that I'm writing. I get very focused.
Fantastic. And could you share maybe, I take it that over the course of years of writing and sort of harnessing your skill, you might have picked up a few tips, especially for perhaps aspiring women writers that are trying to sort of break through with authentic, sort of feminine stories that aren't just about maybe perhaps romance, but also being a woman that goes beyond the sort of the emotional side of us, but also the sort of reason, the feminine reason, if that makes sense.
So I don't know about tips, but I will say this: my second novel that's coming out is very much along what you've just described. It's like it comes from a place in my guts that is about the sort of wonder and confusion of being a woman in the world. I mean, I can't even. It's nuts. It's a nutty book, but it's real from my soul, and it's quite messy. Like, it's not, the themes aren't straightforward, as in, I don't mean, oh, I'm so complicated. I just mean it's not tied up neatly in a little box, because that isn't how life doesn't make sense to me most of the time. So that's sort of what I wanted to reflect. And I think my best advice, if it is of any worth, is for anyone. It's not just women, but particularly women, I think, because our voices we tend to be, there's more shame, I think, maybe around speaking our truth, is just to be as truthful to yourself as you can. And it's exposing. It's really exposing, but it's also brilliant because you can well, I find it really much less exposing than being an actor. I found it being an actor is awful. People criticize you as a entity, you are your work, but then I can hide behind the writing and other characters that I invent, and it's my hiding place, so I feel quite safe. So just be brave, be really brave and write from your guts, and don't be afraid. It'll all be okay in the end.
Yeah, no, I agree with that as well. So, and also I mean, I'm quite lucky to have a little bit of publishing knowledge as well as writing. But I would say that the tables are turning. It is becoming a more inclusive community within writing, not just for women, but for minority voices, people who haven't been represented, underrepresented, represented writers. But writing, truthfully, is the most important thing, because there's nothing worse than reading a submission from a publishing point, reading a submission where someone has come out of their comfort box and is writing what they think is cool and what they think is wanted and what they think will sell, rather than something that has the heart and the emotion in it. It is still quite hard for women, and that's why a lot of women still like to use sort of pen names, or forgive me, I'm tired, pseudonyms, yeah, pen names, pseudonyms, and also sort of like J.K. Rowling, not using their full name because they're worried about how they might be perceived within the genre. She probably not the best example to use in today's life, but she writes under Robert, is it Galbraith, for her thriller crime series. Would she have been taken seriously if she had written under her J.K. Rowling, or even Joanne Rowling? She went for a male, masculine sounding name. Only men can write thrillers within the crime and industry, because that's what's perceived to be the norm. But actually it's changing. We've got some fantastic writers coming through nowadays that are sort of displacing that belief, I suppose. But don't be afraid to write, and if you've got something that's ready for submission, and you particularly want to submit to female authors, or female publishers or agents, then research, sort of see who writes in your genre. What everyone always says, compare your work to 3 pieces of current fiction. I'd never really like that saying, because we write something that's individual to us, but it does help, because if you can name 3 pieces of recent or current fiction that's been published, you can then research those authors' agents. You can see whether or not they're interested in something within that particular thread, or whether or not their books are full, or their catalogues are full. And if they're not, then as I found, if they like it but they can't take it on, they'll forward you to another agent, and they'll say, I haven't got a space for another feminist dystopia at the moment, our catalogue's full, but can I push you towards so and so? But just never be afraid to write what you know, and believe in yourself. Yeah, that's my advice there. And don't be put off if no agents ever want to pick up your work, because they can still get published. It's hard, but you can.
That's so true. I know quite a lot of people who aren't represented who have been very successful recently. I'm part of a writers group here in North London, and there are about 7 or 8, and they're very, very good literary fiction writers. I had to sort of audition to get in. It was terrifying. But I've been part of that group for about 7 years. And one of them he's an incredible writer. And for whatever reason, it beats me. He hadn't had any of his work published. I cannot understand it. He's the genius. But anyway, finally, he's not represented. He sent his work out, and somebody, as indie press, got hold of him and said, we'd like to publish this, and it's coming out in May.
Amazing.
It's called the Lightman series, by the way, if you If you if you see it around, get it, because it'll be really good.
So you also mentioned genre, sort of conventions and maybe constraints, but would you say then that you think about your genre sort of actively when you write, or is the norms of the genre something you follow, or something you just keep at the back of your mind?
I don't really follow the genre norms at all, which again was why it was so difficult to place. And I think even within, so for me, my genre is science fiction and fantasy, with dark fiction, speculative, as all sort of little subgenres. This particular genre of fiction is absolutely so inclusive, it's unreal, and I'm really proud of the community that we've got, because they are taking risks. They're they're subverting the genre and publishing things that 10 years ago mainstream publishers wouldn't even look at. The likes of Tor.com has come on leaps and bounds from the classical D&D style adventures. So from my particular, I don't ever look at it and go, I must make something, overtly science fictional or overtly fantasy. I just write what I can, have a look at it at the end and go, where would this fit? And if it's heavy fantasy, then it's heavy fantasy. If it's so balanced in the middle, then yeah, second draft I might go back through and emphasize or delete some aspects to make it fit into a genre or whatnot. But because I live and work in such a horrible real world, I like what my genre allows me, that escapism to just not think about crime, thrillers, all this sort of stuff. So for me, I am firmly within my genre fiction, and don't tend to steer from it. So I can't offer much outside of that, really.
I definitely don't write in one. Well, I don't write in one specific genre, and I don't write consciously in a genre. I just wanted to tell the story that I told in that first novel, not because I saw myself as a science fiction writer, but because I had a science fiction idea, and I love science fiction ideas in general. Just I'm obsessed with quantum mechanics. But anyway, so my second book is not like that. It's completely different, and that can be problematic for a new writer in this day and age. But fortunately, I was very lucky that my editors and my editor at my publishing house, was, I don't know what the word is, sort of relaxed enough or broad-minded enough or something, but he just said, no, I want to take that novel as well. So so that was really wonderful, and actually quite a surprise, not only to me, but also to my literary agent. So I think don't make assumptions, I suppose, is what I would say, because you never know what's going to happen. I mean, in any way.
And yeah, don't read the popular books from 2022. Don't look, or 2021. Don't look at what was a massive hit in 2021 when writing your book in 2022, because if you were to sell it to a publishing house, it's going to be 18 to 24 months before it's published. And what is popular now might not be what's popular in a couple of years' time. So it comes back to that: write what you love, write the story that's true to yourself. And if it's what these agents and editors and publishing houses are after, it will find a home. Or if you go with a smaller press, it could be just a story that sings to the person who's reading that submission, and they must publish it. But don't write to the market, is what I'm saying, is write what you love.
I totally agree with you. And if you're writing what you love, you'll find weird echoes of what you're writing happening in the world, like Sammy was saying about her novel, and mine too. It's and a friend of mine's a playwright, and I went for a walk with her the other day, and she was telling me about a novelist friend of hers who'd written a novel, a thriller about a woman, and her husband had been killed in a surfing accident, and then this writer, a few years later, her husband was killed in a surfing accident, and she said, it's like I you know, rather than writing it and it becoming the future, it was almost like she'd already channeled herself into the future, if you see what I mean. So it was almost like she was channeling, you know. I think when you're writing, if you're really writing from your soul, you're tapping into the greater consciousness, and that then magic can happen then, I think.
Is it okay to go to a few questions from the chat now, because we've only got you guys booked for an hour? So talking about weird echoes of the future, Lily's most recent question in the chat: do you hope to influence people's perception of the future and or change the way they act? And how do you approach the notions of hope and future building in your books?
That's a good question. I do think that I don't think I actively hoped to change people's, because I'm not that arrogant, but I think that, you know, when you make any piece of art, you're trying to speak to people, aren't you? Other people, you're trying to affect them in some way, not to control them, but just to move them in some way. And I suppose in that respect, yes, I did hope to change the way people thought about, well, or just make them think things they probably already think, but think again about those things, about the world. What was the second part of the question, Adam? That it was.
And how do you deal with building a sense of hope about the future?
Well, I mean, depends where your philosophy is on what it means hope. I suppose this goes back to what I was saying earlier about my editor talking to me about the ending of my novel, and I don't see it as my responsibility to build hope necessarily in my art. I really don't. I know that's what people like, but I would like to write about the world as I see it and reflect it that way. But I did have to change the ending of my novel to make it more hopeful. So that's how I deal with it. I get told to by my editor.
Cheer up type of
yeah,
thing.
Yeah, get over yourself.
And
So,
Sammy, I guess you look to change people's perceptions of the future or change the way they act, yeah?
yeah, so there is a wonderful sexual abuse psychologist called Zoe Lodrick that I always harp on about. And she has the 5 Fs that she describes a sexual abuse victim will behave: fight, flight, freeze, friend, and flop, I think they are off the top of my head. So they're not necessarily those people who will scream, get off me. So I wanted to show a different sexual abuse survivor and how they behave, so that we've got, I'm not saying that what I write is right, by the way. This is one example of how somebody would behave. There is no right or wrong answer, or right or wrong behavior even, sorry. But I want people to be able to read it to understand why some people perhaps don't talk about abuse or can't vocalize what's happened to them and can't trust people close to them with what's gone on. So I wanted to sort of give this to the reader for them to absorb, take away. You know, if you get those 1-star reviews, fine, but you might get those people who actually understand what's gone on. My novel doesn't necessarily end on a hopeful note, but it does have a sense of completion for our main victim. You know, how it ends is how she wants it to end. And that's ultimately a good thing. You know, she has control of her life. She hasn't got control throughout this entire book, but she is able to control her behavior at the end. And that's a really important thing. I think that she's taken back control from those that would take it from her. So I agree with Susannah. It's really difficult to have, you know, hopeful endings potentially in these sort of novels. There is a little subgenre of fantasy called like Noble Bright at the moment, which is a very, instead of this grim dark fantasy that's come out where every character is shades of grey and there's lots of murders, there's lots of rapes, and it's utterly depressing and horrible. some writers are writing Noble Bright, which is a very classical, almost 1980s sort of happy-go-lucky feeling fantasy. So there are those stories out there that have a more hopeful and positive ending, but probably not Anna. But it is a story that I wanted to tell.
Kind of on that note, and as our final question from the audience, and this is one of Ezra's, you're both very inspiring women, and writers independently of being women. So Ezra's question is, do you think strong female leads written by female authors are taken seriously yet? Or is there still a big gender gap, especially in sci-fi and fantasy?
Okay. I think there is still a big gender gap, yes. The big sellers in the mainstream presses do still tend to be men, because certain pockets of readership perhaps don't want to take a chance on a female fantasy writer. For whatever reason, they seem to think that we'll just fill our books with fluffy romance, harems, and all this other spicy erotica or whatnot. So a lot of female science fiction and fantasy writers aren't taken seriously, but there are some excellent writers out there. Anna Smith-Spark is one of them. She's a Harper Voyager author with her trilogy of novels, which are grim dark, but they are beautifully written. The prose in them is just second to none, and I always recommend them to everybody. And as soon as people sort of realize that actually women can write good fantasy, the doors are opening. I mean, certainly with small presses like ours, we're run by women. We're absolutely all about female empowerment and publishing female writers, as well as men, of course, Adam. But there is still a big gender gap, but it is getting smaller. I mean, if you go back 20-30 years, it was your Robert Jordans of the world, your R.A. Salvadors, but now you've got your Anna Smith-Sparks, your Anna Stevens. You've go on, Adam.
There was an odd thing, because I did grow up, and there was like a 5-year period where you had Marion Zimmer Bradley, Sherry S. Tepper,
Elizabeth Hayden,
Juliet E. McKenna, and I was kind of reading all of that, and then there was like this weird gap.
Yeah.
And the female writers disappeared. But
but they are coming back.
Okay.
We are seeing them come back, and obviously Juliet is still prolific. And since had her British Science Fiction Award nomination come through as well for Green Man's Heir, I think it is, or one of her Green Man trilogy. So these authors are coming back. But yeah, it was about 2005 to about 2013-14. There just wasn't many. We did hark back, and that really was with the emergence of Grimdark and Joe Abercrombie and authors similar to him sort of hit this new subgenre of fantasy, and they did dominate it for a while. But now the women are sort of coming back with their pieces of work within these genres, and doing really well. I mean, I think it's Alicia Wanstell-Burke. She's an indie author, and she's released 2, soon to be her 3rd novel. They're independently published, but they are absolutely fantastic novels within the grimdark science fiction fantasy sort of genre, and she's sort of leading the way, I think, for a lot of people to have faith in their work and to submit it.
Okay, and just a quick final word from Susannah. Do you perceive this gender gap as well in the genre?
I don't feel qualified to speak about this, because I think Sammy's covered everything that I could possibly. I mean, I'm going to be really honest, I don't read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. I just don't. I watch a lot of science fiction. I've watched pretty much every science fiction film probably ever made. But I don't, I've read all of the classic, I read a lot of classic sort of science fiction, John Wyndham, John Christopher, Ursula Le Guin, Isaac Asimov. But I have read far fewer modern writers. I've read Emily St. John Mandel, Margaret Atwood, but I'm not, like, Sammy is the expert, so I don't really feel qualified to speak about in the genre. I feel like women writers are pretty well represented as 50% of the population. So yeah, that would sorry, that's not a very educated response, is it? But that's my honest response.
Hey, it's not a test. It's not a test. Okay, thank you both so much. That was amazing.